All right, hello everyone. I'm saying this for the benefit of all of the online folks who follow this thing for some crazy reason. We are going to start on the week 8 material, and it's actually not too terribly long, so hopefully we'll be able to finish. And we did most of our homework, if not all of our homework last time, so we shouldn't have to worry about too much of that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and make sure we review the week 7 assignment and then get right into week 8. On the week 7 assignments, we only had part of it left. So we'll just start with, I believe it was number 5 that we started with last time. And we'll just go through that. So question 5 said, which of the 3 verses in section 3, important passages, would you say was most significantly impacted by how its key preposition was translated? Why? I love questions like this because there's almost like no way to get it wrong unless you just pick something that wasn't one of the main verses, and then that would be a bit of a problem. But the others, as long as you basically picked one of the verses and explained it, it's kind of hard to get wrong. But with that said, does anyone want to volunteer to share theirs with the class?
Pick C.
Pick C, okay.
I have an incomplete sentence, I just realized.
Oh no.
Was the church built on Peter? And also something, okay, that's right. Was the church actually built on Peter? That's right. I have an incomplete thought going here, don't I?
Kind of sounds like it.
Yeah.
And I picked for my number 1, I did categorize them, but I did pick number 1, and it just basically said Peter is not the one that God built the church on.
Well, let's... Okay, so say that again.
Peter is not the one.
No, the whole thing.
Oh.
The whole answer.
Oh, okay. Basically, I picked Matthew 16:18, and basically said Peter is not the one that God built the church on. Basically, the only one.
Yeah, that works.
Does that kind of help?
Yeah, I'm not going to be overly picky on one that's that general, but yeah, that's the basic gist of it.
Yeah, I didn't do a lot of detail. It's just because that's kind of the basics that I got out of that one.
And that one I think was the one that we spent the most time on, so
Yeah. So.
That works.
Because, you compared it to the way the Catholics believe that and, all that kind of stuff. So that was pretty impressive, I thought. So.
Yep, it is. Prepositions are important little things.
Yes.
They make a lot of difference.
Yes. And I liked Ephesians 2 as well. I mean, I liked them all, but yeah. So.
Well, they're all verses in the Bible, and as a Christian, we would kind of hope that you liked them all. That would be a good thing. There was this one verse in there I didn't really like it, so I just kind of blacked it out. And
Black marker.
it's my special highlighter. Yeah. No.
Exactly.
All right, number 6. This one was very open-ended, and it could end in a lot of different ways. Number 6 said, find a verse in the interlinear that has a preposition with multiple case-based meanings. And I had to say, find one with multiple, because there are some prepositions that only take on one case in the New Testament. So you actually have to look and make sure that the preposition that it uses actually has more than one meaning that could apply. After you did that, how would the meaning of the verse change if one of the other cases were used after the preposition? Very open-ended. This could be pretty much, I found this verse and it does technically have multiple meanings here, but in this context it'd be kind of more or less the same. Or it could be, well, this is completely different. And pretty much any subtlety in between. So any volunteers on sharing what they found on that one?
I found one that actually didn't change. It was Philippians 3:21. And the phrase, by the exertion of, or it could be according to the exertion of, which was the accusative, or down from the exertion of, was the genitive. And basically the according to and down from did not change it enough to make the meaning anything.
Yeah, in that context, we would probably take it a little bit more in a non-concrete way anyways.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's not going to significantly affect a whole lot there.
Yes.
So, yeah, that works.
I think I did Matthew 4:6. So why do I have 3 verses written down?
because you were being thorough.
Is that what I was doing?
You're being an
Because I had a
Well-
genitive, a dative, and an accusative for my, there was epi.
Yeah.
Okay. And they
Did-
had different meanings. Each word in each verse, it was either on or upon. Well, those two could be kind of the same.
That would
Or
be
against.
somewhat similar. Against would definitely be a little bit different.
Yeah.
It could be at least, yeah.
That's true.
In epi, the idea of against is physically against, so it's not necessarily like I'm against someone. It's
Right.
not like that.
It's up against.
Yeah.
Yeah, physically, yes.
But it would be a little bit different. So yeah, that works. Yeah. So it was mostly just something to get you guys into the text, into the interlinear, hunting around, looking for things. That's mostly what it was about.
Okay.
And if you happen to find something cool on the way, great. And if you happen to discover that there's lots of words in the interlinear, well, you at least got halfway there, which is true. So yeah, most things on that one, I pretty much accept anything as long as you actually went through and you found the preposition in the verse and you actually looked at the different definitions and you made some kind of an assessment as to what it would do to the verse. As long as you have those things, it's good. Number 7. How many common Koine adverbs are there?
Or 16.
Yes. I also love questions like this one because as opposed to number 6 where you do a lot of searching, this one's like, one answer, we're done, we're good.
Here's the chart.
I can count them.
I can count them, that's right.
When in doubt. And I think I actually said in the notes that there was specifically
Yes,
16, I think.
you did.
Yeah, so that one was not too bad, especially compared to the one before it.
Yes.
So yeah, it was a good change. So yeah, the answer to number 7, just reinforcing for the people online, was indeed 16. There are 16 common Koine adverbs. Should have made people list them and find a verse that has each one. That would be really mean, and that would take forever.
That would be mean.
That would be very mean. Number 8. Can multiple adverbs be used together in a single Koine sentence? If so, give an example. If not, explain why it isn't possible. This one, honestly, was kind of a trick question, but I didn't think it was too bad. But there are some people that it would definitely mess up. What'd you guys find for that one?
I said, yes, you can. So it just tends to make your sentence more formal. As an example, G.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I actually gave you an example in the text that, well, in the notes that actually had multiple adverbs in it. And so when it says give an example, you can say, hey, there was the example. It's right there.
1 Corinthians 3:2.
That's what I put down, yep.
We got this.
And it just makes it more complicated.
Pretty much. Yeah, it makes it much harder to interpret there. Yep.
Yeah, because I put down, but presently you are
Yes.
still not
You're too
capable.
far.
You're not married yet. Yeah, yes.
Yep. So good on that one. And then we already did 9 through 14 on the previous week, so we don't need to worry about that. But we did have the translation material, 15 and 16. What did we come up with for 15? And I just realized I forgot to capitalize the P on Poloi. Sadness.
Sooner. Sorry.
I said, for many will come on the basis of my name.
On the basis of my name, that would be stylistically correct. It's not formally correct, but stylistically that's how most people would translate it.
Okay. And I've got, for many will come on the basis of the name of me.
Yes, it does have the article in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, stylistically most people aren't going to translate it that way because it's really awkward English.
It's not the way we talk anymore.
Yeah. But technically the Greek does have an article, and so the English, if it's going to be fully representative, would have to have an article. But that's an issue of stylistics. The basic meaning is still there.
They do a lot of stylistic translations.
Most translations are going to have some stylistic basis in them because they want it to be readable. And if you just take the Greek directly across into English as the original Greek is, most people aren't going to be able to make heads or tails
A
of
lot
it.
of people, yeah, or languages.
Yeah, we don't talk like that because we're not Greek. All right, and then number 16.
Y'all are already clean.
That would definitely be a stylistic one right there.
Southern.
That would be very stylistic right there.
Yeah, you all are already clean. That's what.
That would do, yeah. And there's a few different word orders that you could have with this, and adverbs are just that way. Because in English we can throw certain adverbs in different places and it could mean the same thing.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, that's the basic gist of it. So that will do. Yay! Well, that was relatively painless. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started on the week 8 lesson. And of course that means we have a quiz. So let's get the music queued up here. No, quizzes are good for you.
That's what they say. Yeah, so is the teacher.
Yeah, teachers are slightly biased. They kind of want their students to do well. Right, so here is your quiz. 5 questions as normal. Remember, I gave you a chart of prepositions that gave their relative locations. Number 2, we did some of these in class, not last time, but time before last. And we all said that we liked them and that they were easy, so I figure, hey, good quiz question.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's do.
And I think my computer just dropped the internet connection.
Uh-oh.
So I might have to do the rest without music. Sadness. And number 5 is definitely a review question. We'll have to go back to previous lessons for that one.
Okay, explain number 4. I want to make sure I'm getting it right.
Okay, so one of these words is not in the same category as the other words is. It's a different type of word.
Is it in our work? Specifically?
Kinda, sorta, but not really. Yeah. The words that all belong together are in the work, but that particular one is not because it doesn't belong.
Where would I go to find it?
It will be in the last lesson, so it'll be in the week 7 material. Number 5, on the other hand, it's not in the week 7 material at all.
I need a little more help on number 4.
Last week we only covered 2 classes of words. And the words there, most of the words there, I should say, will belong to one of those 2 classes. And then the odd man out, of course, is the wrong one. And last week, what were the 2 main categories that we discussed?
We discussed adverbs.
And?
I don't know. Important passages.
With the title of the list.
Oh, prepositions.
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 So most of these words will either be adverbs or prepositions. Once you figure out which one that one is, you find the one that's not in that category.
Okay. So.
Yeah, I think that's probably the worst thing about Greek class. You always feel like you're back in grammar school.
Indeed.
And there was always that annoying student who understood everything, and you're still just sitting there trying to figure out what on earth a gerund is.
Yeah.
And why do we care about Jerry in the first place? But the good news is that most people will probably get number 3 right.
Or what?
Most people will probably get number 3 right.
I'm just going to guess on number 4. I'll get it wrong, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's why we have the bonus. If you get one wrong, it's not the end of the world.
Okay, so the adjectival function is indicated by the following verb form. Which lesson did we learn? I remember us discussing that. I just can't remember what it was.
That one. Actually, I don't remember which week it was either. That was a while back.
It was
The
week
one before
5.
this one.
Yeah, the one before this one or 2?
Where did I find it?
So in week
Well,
5 or is it
adjectives.
in it? That's what I was.
That'd be week 5, right?
Okay.
And I think this was another one that I gave you guys a chart on. At least I'm pretty sure I gave you a chart on it. I think it would be kind of hard without a chart.
Yes, it was a chart. Very handy.
Okay, I think I did it. We'll just
I did it. All right, so are we all done with getting through the 5 questions?
Yes.
Wonderful. There we go.
Says
And
you.
hey, from my point of view, everything's easy. So what the great advantages of having it all done beforehand. All right, now let's get back into it. And some kind of a pen will be nice. All right, so for number 1, which preposition best describes the location of the pen relative to the hand? There's probably 1 or 2 that you could make some kind of an argument for, and all of them in some sense you could probably argue is appropriate, but I think there is one that most people would agree fits the best. What did you guys come up with?
A. I said letter A.
There you go. N, which means what in Greek? In. Yeah, so the pen is in the hand.
That was the simplest for sure.
Yeah.
It's certainly the most direct on it.
Yes.
And do we remember what meta is? With and after. So, yeah, the pen is with the hand. I mean, that's not entirely inaccurate, but probably not the best. Ace.
Yeah, I didn't even look at the other ones because that one was the one that would fit, so I don't think I
looked
learned.
at that one on my list. I have a list of them on the card.
That's like into or among.
Yeah.
Oh, ace, there it is, into or among.
Yeah, it kind of denotes a certain amount of action,
Yeah.
and we don't necessarily have the pin actually going into the hand.
Right.
It's just a picture of it in the hand, so into, not quite as much. I mean, yeah, you have to put the pen into the hand before you use it, but probably not the best. But like I said, you could kind of justify it a little bit. And then hoopa. What one was that one? Under. That one would definitely be a little bit more of a stretch. I mean, yeah, I mean if
Under
you're,
the one finger, but
it's-
it's not under the hand.
yeah,
Yeah, the way it's positioned, you can tell it's not under. It might be under the finger,
Yeah.
but not under the hand.
not the hand as a whole. Yeah, it'd be quite a bit harder to justify that one. But yeah, N is what I was looking for. Like I said, there's maybe some arguments for the other ones, probably not so much hoopa, but N is the one I was looking for. And like I said, most people I think would probably get that one done just fine. It was fairly natural. Number 2, determine the missing parsing code. And this is one of the ones that when we went through, it was like, hey, that's actually relatively easy. So I said, that's a good quiz question. And what did we find out was the pattern with these ones?
It takes on the next word's thingy.
The first, after the dot.
Yes.
It takes on,
Preposition, so it's P dot.
yeah, it's a preposition, and then it takes on whatever the following case is.
Yes, there we go.
Yeah. And so in our case, what's the case?
B.
The case is B.
Accusative.
Accusative, right?
Accusative, sorry.
Which
I was giving that-
happens to be B, yes.
Yes, sorry.
Now here's one I'm actually a little bit curious on. Did you spot one of these that definitely had to be wrong?
I didn't because I just honed in on the right
Oh,
answer.
because one of them is not.
Yeah, there's a couple of cases that prepositions will never take on.
Oh.
No. What was D? I think it's D.
Dative, genitive.
I have to go back to that paper, but I think it's D.
Yeah, there's 2 cases that it can never take on, and one of them is put here. And you are right.
Am I right?
Mhm.
Letter D,
The nominative. The nominative, a preposition cannot take on. And then there's one other one besides the nominative. Which one would that one be?
It would be the dative?
Nope.
No. Genitive then.
Nope.
Oh.
There's 5 cases total. There's only 4 up here.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah. The genitive, accusative, and dative prepositions can take those on. That's not a big problem. But the nominative and then one other one, well, the prepositions cannot take those. They cannot be influenced by those.
Vocative?
There you go.
Okay.
Yep, the vocative. Woohoo! All right, number 3. Number 3, I'm always a little bit hesitant about these ones because it's basically a 50-50 shot. But I also figured we covered this one enough in class that most people would probably get it anyways. So, Paul wrote a letter to the Laodiceans. Is that true or false?
It's false.
It is false. What does the text actually say in Greek?
Basically, he's just telling them to give them a letter that has been, it's like a circular letter that's being passed around, just saying, make sure.
It says that there was a letter from the Laodiceans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
never says that Paul wrote to the Laodiceans, but it says that there's a letter coming from the Laodiceans.
There you go. Very good.
All right, and then number 4 gave us a little bit of a hard time, and that's mostly just because most people in their normal day-to-day lives do not sit there and think about what category which words go in. That is not a hobby for most people, I would imagine. But what did we come up with for an answer for 4?
A.
You got the A.
I got A as well.
That is actually correct.
Adjective.
It is,
Your adverbs.
and the others are adverbs. Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, our lesson we had adverbs and prepositions. Most of these turned out to be adverbs, so the odd man out was the adjective.
Okay. There you go.
Yep. Yeah, this lesson wasn't on adjectives, so there you go. And then finally, number 5, the bonus question. Which adjectival function is indicated by the following word order? DRP, adjective, and no noun.
Substantival.
Substantival, yep.
Sense.
There's a few different ways to pronounce it, so don't worry about that.
Okay. That's it.
And I can't spell.
Oh, so it's none of those?
Yeah, it's substantive.
Substantival.
That's the word I was supposed to find?
Yeah. Because we're looking for the function.
Yeah. It gives you a word order, and you have to find the one that matches that.
I'm so stupid.
Yeah.
I put that number 1.
You put that number.
Yeah.
You're thinking too hard.
I looked at it.
Okay.
I did look at it, and I copied it right across.
I was like, okay.
Number 4, fried you, didn't it?
Huh?
Number 4, fried you, didn't it?
That's hilarious.
That is
Okay.
kind of funny.
So how did you find the substantival?
Well, if you look at the little chart, it's got a DRP.
So you have to start with the DRP in the word order.
Uh-huh.
And
And
then
then
it has
af-
an adjective. The next column over has an adjective.
Oh, and then no. Okay,
And
there
then
we go.
no.
And then what-
See,
yeah.
I didn't. Yeah, I just saw the chart and said, "Oh, that's the DRP chart." Da, da, da. Okay.
We all need days like that.
Yeah.
We all have days like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fine. All right, so
I'm not fun.
that's okay. It's good. All right, so how many of us got at least 3 out of 4 with the bonus? Ta-da! And
I got the first 4 right.
so you get at least 3 out of 4.
You got at least 3 out of 4.
So you're good. Woohoo! All right, today, new stuff, of course. We're going to be going over verbs. We're going to have our first section is basically just going to be a little bit of an introduction, cover some of the stuff that we've done before. That's what the person number is about. We've already covered person number. Verbs have them too, it turns out. But we've already covered it, so we're not going to have to do a lot of detail there. The second section will be tense, and there are a number of tenses in Greek, so we're going to have to spend a little bit more time there. And then the third section, we're going to throw voice and mood in together. We've actually already talked about voice a little bit, enough to confuse us. It was that whole active-passive thing, and when we had the cases, it was like, I'm just going to kill this part of the paper right here and take it out and crumple it. But technically, we did cover it a little bit, so it's not going to take as much time. And there are not as many moods. There's only 4 moods in Greek. All right, so that is the overview. Let's get into it. Introduction and person number. All right, the following 6 components are typical of Koine verbs. When you do your parsing, this is going to be how it parses. The first is going to be the type of word, of course, and in this case it's going to be a verb. You always have the type that's going to be the same with any word that's out there. I always start with the type, and then after the first dot, you're going to have tense, voice, and mood. This is for normal verbs. Now, participles and infinitives are a little bit different. We'll cover them next time. But for a normal verb, it's going to have tense, voice, and mood, and then after that, person and number. As long as you get those 6 parts, you'll be able to cover most anything that's going to come up relative to verbs. And like I said, some of this is old material, some of it is brand new. And I tried to introduce some things fairly early on just so that we wouldn't have to spend as much time here, but there's always going to be a certain amount of review that you have to do no matter what. It's just life. Right, so part B here, 2 of these components, person and number, have already been discussed in the context of other word types, especially pronouns. When we went over pronouns, we talked about person and number a lot. Person is, first person, second person, third person. Is it me? Is it the person that I'm talking to? Or is it someone who's outside of the conversation? That's first, second, and third person. Me, first person, person I'm talking to, second. Someone who's outside of the conversation is third person. And then the number was basically singular or plural. Is it more than one person, or is it just one person? Is it he, or is it they? Things like that. Now this winds up producing some interesting things with Koine verbs. Since a Koine verb can have both person and number, it can stand in for the nominative, which is a case that we've already discussed before, but it's basically the subject. It can stand in for the nominative of a clause. In which case, it will be translated with an implied pronoun. And this actually occurs pretty often in Greek, and in your homework you've actually already had cases where I've translated the verb for you, and I included a pronoun or pronouns as the case may be. And some people paid attention to that, and some people were just like, well, this is torturous. It just kind of depends. But you have technically already seen places where the verb will be translated with pronouns. And this is why. It's because they have person and number, so there's always an implied pronoun there. The question is whether or not it's necessary. If the clause already has a nominative, you don't need the implied pronoun because you already have something to fill the subject's role. You already have a subject of the sentence. But if there is no subject of the sentence given there, there's no nominative, that's when you pull out that implied pronoun and you use it instead. All right, so any questions on this slide, A, B, and C?
Not yet.
Not yet. Just wait for it. All right, D. The implied pronoun in the verb can be very important when exegeting the text. And that means drawing out of the text, drawing out the meaning of the text. As opposed to eisegeting the text, which is putting in something that the text doesn't say. This is mostly just your fun random words for the day kind of thing right here. What is the difference between exegeting and eisegeting? Exegeting comes from the Greek preposition ek, which means out from. Eisegeting comes from the Greek preposition eis, which means into. So exegeting is drawing out from the text. Eisegeting is, or we say eisegeting in English, but eisegeting means you're putting something into the text that wasn't there. That's a bit of a problem. All right, so what do I actually mean by all that? Well, those are some nice big fancy words, but practical application. So let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 15:29, which is one of the favorite verses of my Mormon friends. Because they believe, as you guys probably already know, they believe in baptism for the dead. And they love pulling out the Bible and saying, well, the Bible teaches baptism for the dead. Well, we're going to discuss that a little bit. Let's take a look at the verbs first here. We'll do the whole verse and then take a look at the verbs. The whole verse is otherwise, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, then why are they baptized for them? The first verb that is there, it parses as a verb. That's what the V is. And then FAI, if you guys have your little parsing chart, Ounce's parsing system, what does the F mean? Nope.
Oh.
You're looking under verbs.
Oh, I am. I should be looking under...
future.
Future, yep. And then the A.
Active.
Active, good. And then the I.
Indicative.
Perfect. And then the 3P is something that we've actually seen before. That is the person and number.
Yeah, third person.
Third person, and then the P is?
Oh, plural.
Plural, there you go. And we're going to focus on that 3P right now. The other part of it we'll get to, but right now we're going to focus on something that's a little bit more familiar, the 3P. What does 3P mean? We already said that means third person. So as a pronoun, what would that be? What kind of a pronoun would a third person pronoun? They. Yeah, it has to be plural, so it has to be more than one.
Right.
And it's someone who's not directly in the conversation. So it's not me, it's not you, it's someone outside.
Them.
So they, them, something that's outside. Works. Good. And then the second verb there, it parses as a verb, and then it's PPI. What does the first P mean there?
So that's present.
Present, perfect. And then I need to be more careful about that word because there's actually a perfect tense in Greek.
Yes.
But yes, present. And then the second P is
Passive.
good. And then the I,
Indicative.
perfect. And then we have that same 3P thing going on again. And again, it's going to have to be translated as some pronoun that tells us that this is outside of the conversation. So they, them, something like that. Now, in this particular translation, they use those and they. This one right here, I have a major problem with. I don't like it when they put in those. Any ideas?
Well, that's a particular.
What kind of pronoun is those? Is it a personal pronoun? No, it's not.
No, it isn't.
What kind of pronoun is it?
Just
It's a demonstrative. So like these, those. Now the verb itself, it's third person, which is basically going to imply a personal pronoun. They translated it with something that wasn't a personal pronoun, which just grinds my gears to the nth degree. It's not. There's no demonstrative in the verb, but they translated it as if it did. And they did that mostly for stylistic reasons. You know, it sounds nice. You know, it's cool. But I really don't like that. Something that was actually truly third person would have been better, in my opinion. But they didn't ask me, so yeah.
Those is not demonstrative?
No, those is a demonstrative.
It is a demonstrative.
And the problem is that we have something that's third person, so it should be a personal pronoun, not a demonstrative. But they put used a demonstrative. Right, so how does that relate to the whole issue with the Mormons and baptism for the dead?
why get baptized for them if they're not going to raise from the dead?
Well, that was the question that Paul was asking. But is this saying that either Paul or the people that he was writing to, the Corinthians, is this saying that either Paul or the Corinthians ever were baptized for the dead?
No, it's not.
It's not saying that at all.
No. And we know that because these verbs are third person. It's saying them, over there,
Someone else.
they.
Someone else.
It's not us.
Yeah.
Paul never did this. The Corinthians never did this. Now, when the Mormons read it, they really like it when it says those, because those is generic enough that you could kind of twist it into saying that this was the Corinthians, but it's not. Instead, the implied pronoun, which would be they, I crossed out the those because it's technically inaccurate, they shows that Paul was excluding himself and his audience from those who practice baptism for the dead. Grammar is a very important thing when it comes to doctrine.
Okay, so say that again.
Okay, so just as it says on the screen there, Paul was excluding himself and his audience from those who practice baptism for the dead. He used third person. It wasn't him, it wasn't the people he was talking to, it was another group. And historically, there were many pagans who actually practiced baptism rites on behalf of the dead. And so what Paul is basically saying is, even the pagans understand that there's a resurrection. And that's why they have baptism for the dead. But he was never saying that either he or the people that he was writing to practiced this. So basically, he's getting after the Corinthians for being stupider than the pagans.
And that's pretty insulting.
Yeah, Paul had an interesting way about him. He is, on the one hand, very earnest and very loving, but at the same time, he's very direct and very blunt. I love you, but you're stupid. He just kind of had that way about him. Tell us how you really feel, Paul. Okay, so that's an example of where knowing how the implied pronouns and verbs can be a handy thing and a fairly important thing when it comes to certain issues.
So with those, what did you say it should be?
It's third person, so it should be something like they or them.
Okay.
Those is not.
Yeah, it's not a personal pronoun. It's a demonstrative. All right, so any other questions on this slide, D through F? Not yet. Not at this particular moment in time. All right. G, since Koine verbs can have implied nominative pronouns, all that nominative means is that these things can stand in for the subject of a clause. That's all that that means. Since Koine verbs can have implied nominative pronouns, they can function as complete sentences by themselves. So if there is no other nominative in the sentence, just pull it out from the verb and you've got a complete sentence. And so in Greek, you can actually have a sentence that is a single verb. You can have a sentence that is nothing but verbs. And it's because they all have implied pronouns. Well, most of the normal verbs, I should say, have implied pronouns. Participles, and that's a little different. Participles are weird.
Okay.
All right, so here is one example. Edakrusin. Edakrusin, we've actually seen this before in John 11:35. There it had a few other words with it, but if Luke had so desired, he could have made that verse into just one word, and it would have been edakrusin. And the parsing code for it is verb, and then what does the first A there mean? Aorist. Yeah. And that's fine, it's a new word. So aorist, and then the second A is active, and then the I is perfect. And then the 3S, what's that? Perfect. Now it turns out that edakrusin basically means to weep, and then when you take all the aorist and the active and the indicative and you throw all that stuff on there and figure out what that does to the weeping, it actually basically puts it in the past tense, so wept. And then we still have to figure out what does the third person singular do? Well, we only have this one word by itself right now. So we have wept, we have the action in the sentence, now we need a subject. Well, the subject is third person singular, so we need a third person singular pronoun. And so it could be her, well, it needs to be nominative, so it could be she, it could be he. If it's neuter, it could be it, although that's kind of weird to think of as personal, but it wept. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And because we know this comes from John 11:35, it's talking about Jesus, the appropriate pronoun there would be he. So he wept. It's a complete sentence. Technically it's one word, and technically that word is a verb, but it has an implied pronoun. So you can actually translate it as a complete sentence by itself. He wept. It's a very short sentence. Okay, so questions about that one?
Okay, so basically, wept was it was a one-word sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
In Greek.
Yes.
Can't quite do that when we take it over into English, but in Greek, yes, it's a one-word sentence. Yep. And it turns out that this Greek actually does give us, this Greek word does give us an indication as to who that would be. It has an implied pronoun in there. So we pull out the implied pronoun, and we get the subject of our sentence.
Okay.
Yeah, that last part of the verb there, the number and the singular or plural will be an implied pronoun. And you may need to pull it out, you might not. If there's nothing else in the sentence, you're going to need to pull it out. But if the sentence already has a subject, then you don't need to pull it out.
If it's already there, you don't need to worry about it.
If the sentence already has a subject, we already know who's doing it, then we're fine. But if we don't know who's doing it, we'd look at the verb, what's its implied pronoun, pull that implied pronoun out.
So, your first, second, third person, singular and plural, are the implied pronouns.
Exactly.
Basically what you're saying?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Here's another example. LOGO, my ego. No, I'm sorry. LOGO. This one, of course, is a verb. And what does the P stand for?
Present.
Present. And then the A? Active. And then the I? Huh, that's kind of familiar. We keep getting a lot of the ones that have I in there. There's a reason for that. We'll discuss that when we get there. And then after the period, we have one S. What's that?
First person singular.
First person singular. So first person in a conversation is always going to be yourself. And singular means, of course, there's just one. Now, it turns out that lego basically means to speak. And when we take all of the other stuff there, that it's present, that it's active and indicative, it basically means speak. And now we're just wondering who's speaking. Well, there's nothing else in the sentence here. So that tells us we're going to have to take that implied pronoun and pull it out.
Yes.
Well, first person singular, the pronoun for that one would be I.
Yes.
I speak.
Instead of he speak.
Yeah, he speak would be very weird.
Look at
That's a speak with forked tongue.
Yes. Brandon, yes.
Yeah. All right, so this sentence, although it's one word in Greek, we're going to have to use two in English. It'll be translated as I speak. We don't know what he speaks, but we know who was doing it. That's I. All right, so any questions about that?
Always makes good sense when you're going through it like this.
And then you get home on your own doing the homework, and it's like, Yeah. All right, so that is basically the first section, I believe. So we've had our little introduction to verbs, have all the categories there. And it turns out that the last category, person number, we've kind of already dealt with it before. And it's actually pretty easy to figure out. It's basically an implied pronoun. If there's no subject to the sentence, you have to pull the pronoun out so you have a subject. If not, you just leave it as is. The other stuff is where things get interesting. All right, so now that we're done talking about fairly normal stuff, we get to talk about tense. And when it comes to verbs, tense is definitely, it can cause a little bit of tension. I will say that it's probably the most unusual aspect of Greek verbs, just because Greek tense has a very different emphasis than English tense does. All right, so we'll start out by saying that in Koine Greek, a verb's tense relates two basic facts about the action in the verb, which is definitely not what we're used to thinking about in English. The two things that it relates are aspect and time. When most people in English think of verb tense, they almost automatically think of it almost solely in terms of time.
Yes.
We think of it past, present, future, and then there's some combinations and weird things you can do with that, but basically past, present, future. In Greek, there is an element of time there sometimes, but the main emphasis is actually on the first one, on aspect.
Okay.
So, aspect is primary in Greek, and it refers to the nature of the action of a verb as to its beginning, duration, completion, or repetition without reference to its position in time. So you can have something that has been completed in the past, in the present, or in the future, and that could just be one single tense in Greek. The main thing that it's conveying is that this thing is done. It doesn't say when it's done, it's just that it's done. Or it can be something that's ongoing, something that gets repeated, and there's going to be a particular tense for that. And it could be something that's being repeated in the past, it could be something that's being repeated now, it's something that will be repeated in the future. The time element is just not that important in Greek. Instead, aspect is what is primarily important. the state of the action takes precedence over the when of the action in Greek. These ones I debated a lot about how much to put actually in the slide and then how much to have you guys write out on it. Because the more you write, typically the more you remember, but the bad news is it takes longer.
Okay, so aspect is primary. Aspect is primary. Okay, so aspect is primary. It refers to the nature of the action of a verb as to its beginning, duration, completion, or repetition, without reference to its position or action. I mean, you gave some, I was right, in terms of get all of them, you gave some examples.
So there are some examples. Let's say that an action is complete. It could have been completed in the past. I can be completing it now, and I can talk about it as something that will be completed in the future.
Okay.
But in Greek, the emphasis is going to be on the fact that it's complete.
Just that it's complete.
That it's complete. And from context, we'll have to figure out when it's going to be complete. The Greek verb will tell us it's complete. We're oftentimes going to have to use context to figure out when it's complete. Or it could be something that's repeating. Is it repeating in the past? Is it repeating in the present? Is it something that's going to be repeating on down the line?
Now, could it be something that is, say, using repeating,
Right.
but all three?
Something that goes on infinitely. Yeah, that's a possibility.
Okay.
But in Greek, the emphasis is always going to be on the nature of the action, not where the action is in time.
Okay. So the nature of the action is what
Takes precedence.
Okay.
Yeah, which was really weird for me to get used to when it came to Greek, because that is not the way we think of it in English. But time does still play a part in Greek. It is secondary, but it is actually still there. And of course, that's the part that we're used to. It's when the action of the verb takes place. That's how we usually think of tense. And that is a part of Greek tenses. And it actually turns out that tense and mood kind of interact with each other a little bit. And with certain moods, the tense takes on a very definite time aspect. And with certain moods, it doesn't. We'll get into that. But the main thing I want you guys to focus on is the aspect. It's the nature of the action that takes precedence over the time of the action. That is the main thing. And then as far as presenting how all that works out, frankly, I couldn't find a good way to do it, especially based on Mounce's stuff, because in the compact guide, Mounce goes over it, and he is technically correct in everything that he says, but for someone who's not really used to it, it gets really confusing. So I way simplified it down in the chart that I gave you guys.
Okay.
But it's better to start with simple than not. If you want to get confused, you can go to Mounce. Yeah. And that, I don't mean any discredit to Mounce on that one. His stuff is actually very accurate on that one. It's just the compact guide is actually designed for people who've already had a little bit of Greek and then need a refresher. So it's not really designed for what we're doing in that regard, especially when it comes to verbs. All right, so are we done with A, B, and C there?
Yes.
Okay. So this chart briefly explains the 6 Koine tenses. There are 6 tenses in Koine Greek. And those are what we're going to need. Now I've gone ahead and put this kind of in a grid format so that we can see how aspect and time interact. The main thing is going to be the aspect, and those are the ones that are bolded and underlined. And then there's time across the top, and those ones are in italics. They're the ones that are slanted. So past, present, future, that's how we normally think of tense, but that's secondary in Greek. The main thing in Greek is the state of the action. The first state of action, the aspect, is progressive and internal action. So progressive means that it's progressing or that it's ongoing. It's in progress. And internal means that you're looking at it from within the action itself. And it usually has a fair amount of detail to it. You might not actually state the detail, but it's an inside look at things in particular with depth. And the 2 tenses that have that aspect are the imperfect and the present. Now, the tense, the time aspect is not as fixed, but generally the imperfect is going to be more so related to stuff in the past, and the present is going to be stuff that's in the present, which kind of makes sense with how it's named. But they're not absolutely fixed. There are some cases where you can have an imperfect that actually relates to something that's in the future, and you can have a present that's actually related to something in the past. That's not the emphasis. the emphasis is that the state of the action is progressing, that you're looking at it from the inside, that it's internal. So aspect is always primary.
Okay, so because you've got progressive / internal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's progressing internally. Is that another way to say it? Or
well,
No,
it's
two different ones.
it's different emphases that it can have.
Oh, okay.
So oftentimes that it's progressing, but also it has to do with your vantage point. Are you looking at it from the inside or from the outside? With this one, you're looking at it from the inside.
Okay. Okay. Looking at. Okay.
And when it says progressive, it can also be repetitive as well. So if you had a weekly meeting that you go to, like LOGOS, for example, that would be something that you would describe with either an imperfect or a present in Greek, because it's ongoing, it's repetitive.
Progressive to be repetitive. Internal means looking at it internally,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, it's something that you're a part of rather than something that's outside of you,
Okay.
oftentimes. Like with all languages, there's the rules and then there's everything that breaks the rules. All right, and then the next category of aspect is the whole, summary, or external aspect. So instead of looking at something that's progressing, instead you're looking at it as a whole, you're summarizing it, and it's external to you. So it's finished and done with, or it might be something that'll be done in the future, aorist or future, but the main emphasis there is it's external to you and you're looking at it as a whole. You're not looking at it in detail. You're not looking at it from the inside. It's not an ongoing process. It's basically said and done, or it will be said and done.
Okay, say that again. Whole, summary, external. You said that
You're not looking at it from the inside anymore.
Okay,
And it's not something that's ongoing. It's something that there's this action and you're looking at it as a whole. You're not worried about the bits and pieces. You're not worried about the detail anymore. Just the simple fact that it's over and done with, or the simple fact that it will happen.
Not the detail.
Yeah, it's not a detail-oriented view at all.
So like the big picture, if you will.
It's not so much the big picture as it is a distant picture. You don't see detail when you're far away.
Okay.
It's just finished.
It's finished. Or it will be finished. Yeah. But it's just, it is what it is. All right, and then the third category is the completed. But it is completed with effects. And that's where the pluperfect and the perfect come in. So this is an action that has been completed. In the pluperfect, the effects of the action are in the past as well. So it's completed, it's done, and its effects are done as well. In the perfect, the effects are ongoing. So the action was completed, but its effects are still with you. That's what the perfect is. In the pluperfect, the action's done and the effects are done.
Okay, and the pluperfect is what? What two are done?
The action is done and its effects are done as well. The effects are in the past.
The actions and the effects.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so those are the three general categories of aspect and the 6 tenses that are associated with them. And the past, present, future thing is kind of where they show up sometimes as a general rule, but there's a lot of places where those rules are broken. So don't hold on to the past, present, future thing. Don't hold on to that too rigorously. There's one particular mood where they're pretty definite, Other cases, not so much. And we'll talk about that mood. To tell you right now, it's the indicative. The indicative, past, present, future, according to the chart, are pretty stable. Other ones, not so much. Right. Are we done writing things on the chart? This is one I should have just provided blank lines under the chart.
Okay.
All right, let's do an example here. In our first example, we'll just cover one area, the whole, summary, or external. That particular aspect. I wish there was a better name for that one in English. But it is the one that has to do with the aorist and the future. No, maybe that's a way we can say it. And in John 2:23 it shows up. John 2:23 says, "Now while Jesus was in Jerusalem at the feast of the Passover, many people believed in his name because they saw the miraculous signs he was doing." Believed is the verb that we're going to look at here. And of course, we start out with the type of word it is, and it's a verb. So that's there. And then we have AAI, and that first A is what we're going to focus on. That's the tense. And with it being A, that tells us it's an aorist. The second A is active. We'll get to that in a second. And I is indicative. And we've already covered what the 3 and the P do. All right. But the main thing we want to focus in is that first A there, the aorist. It tells us that this believing that these people are doing is being looked at in an external way. Now when and this is an interesting passage in John 2:23. If you look up the entire chapter, it talks about, the miracles that Jesus is doing and people being impressed by him. But it also goes on to say that Jesus did not entrust himself to these people. These people believed in him, but he didn't believe them or believe in them. He didn't entrust himself to them. It's actually the same word in Greek. Believe and trust has the same root. And you also go later on in the Gospel of John and you find out that these people wind up eventually down the road abandoning Jesus. Huh?
Because the miracles disappear.
Well,
They're only believing because they see the miracles.
There you go. This is not a sincere belief. This is and so when John is presenting this, he's presenting this to his audience as something that you don't want to do. Yes, I want you to believe in Christ, but I don't want you to believe like these people. So he presents it as something that's external. This is not the kind of belief that you should have. This should be external to you. And he provides it as this, just a summary of what happened. And they believed. There's no depth to it. There's no progress to it. There's no ongoing nature to it. It's just they believed. No depth, something that's external to the person. Nothing, that's probably the best way to say it, is there's just no depth to their belief. And that's how John is presenting it. Hey, Jesus is this great guy who does miracles, and it's a really cool show, guys. I mean, it's fantastic, and he does really nice things. But there's absolutely no depth at all. And so it would make sense that the Apostle John would use the aorist here. Aorist normally has the emphasis of something that's external and it's summary. There's no depth to it. And aorist is often used in the past, especially with the indicative. So that all makes sense. For the next one, we're going to combine examples here. We're going to do a progressive internal and a completed example together. This will be from John 3:18. So literally just a chapter later. Excuse me. And of course, people know this as the chapter in which Jesus has his conversation with Nicodemus. There's a little bit of debate in scholarly circles as by the time that we get to verse 18, is this still Jesus talking, or is this John providing his commentary? We don't exactly know because Greek didn't exactly have quotation marks in it. So we don't know exactly on that one, but we do know what is said. And so in verse 18 it says, "The one who believes in him is not condemned. The one who does not believe has been condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the one and only Son of God." Let's take a look at the first believes there. This one is going to be a little bit different. This one actually isn't a normal verb, but it does illustrate the tense rather well, so I wanted to use it. But it's not a normal verb. Instead, it's a participle. So that's where the PT comes from. And then it has the first P there, and that actually acts like verbs more or less normally do. And so what does that P there stand for? Present. So that's going to be one of the progressive internals. Present is one of those. Yeah. Just make sure we got that in there. Yep, present. Okay. And then the A is that it's active. Participles, interestingly, do not have a mood. So that is left off. And then you go over to the part on nouns and you pick up those. So the NSM is nominative, singular, masculine. Participles actually behave a lot like nouns. So they have some parts that are like verbs and then some parts that are like nouns. Okay. We will discuss that a lot more next time. But right now, the main thing we're going to focus on there is the fact that it's present. So here, it's a progressive internal aspect. This is something that is ongoing. And it's also something that John is presenting from the internal point of view. This is where he wants his audience. So instead of like it was in John 2:23, where he presents it as something external to them, basically, don't believe like these guys. He's saying, this is how you should believe. This is where you should be. You should be internal to this. And he also presents it as something that's progressing, something that's active. It's not, I believed one time in the past, and so I'm good with God now. You know, I made my peace with him, you know, when I was a kid, you know, all those kinds of things. No. It is an active, ongoing thing.
Okay, so present, like ever present. Or is that
it's not so much that. It's just that it's ongoing. Okay. There's depth to it. It's where you are internally. It's not something that happened in the past or in the future. In this case, it's present. It's something that is continually ongoing now. And then, of course, it goes on to say the one who does not believe. And when it says does not believe, it actually is basically the same verb as before, but it's been negated. So anyone who isn't in that category of those who have this progressive, ongoing, in-depth faith is condemned already. And why is it that he is condemned already? Just by not being in that category, because it says already in there, how is it that they're condemned? Well, John goes on to explain. He says, because he has not believed. And there it's a little bit interesting how he does it. So this one is a normal verb. So instead of a participle, the type is a normal verb. And then we have the R. And what does the R stand for? Yeah, it's perfect. And so this is in the category of the completed aspect. And then the A is active, the I is indicative, 3S is third person singular, and they have not believed in the name of the one and only Son of God. Now, any ideas why the Apostle John in writing this would use the perfect for describing why these people who don't belong to this category of having this in-depth internal faith, why he would use something that's in the perfect to describe them?
It's an ongoing thing. They don't believe, and they still don't believe.
No. But I like where you're going with it, but no. If it was something that was ongoing in its fullness, that would be something that would belong to the progressive and internal category. Instead, perfect is in the completed category.
Oh, so it's not complete. They have completely not believed.
Yeah, it's in the completed category, which means that this action is already done with. But he puts it in the perfect because the effect is still ongoing. Yeah. So what was done in the past, but its effect is still lingering. And this is an interesting thing with the Bible in general, but especially with the Apostle John. When it says that they have not believed, it's not saying in the sense of, they were given a choice and then they rejected. This is something that the choice is already completed. And he's saying that they are default in that category of not believing. So you start out not believing, and by that you are condemned. Lots of people mess that one up. Which is why in Protestant Christianity we actually believe in evangelism.
Okay.
Because we believe that people who are not evangelized actually are in danger of hell. And that is the natural state of man without Christ.
Okay, he's already in the state of not believing. From
His
time past.
Yeah, his not believing is a fact that has been completed in the past. But the effect of not believing is ongoing.
Okay, effect.
So yeah, in the Apostle John's mind, people start out as unbelievers, and the consequences of that unbelief extends throughout their lives.
Okay, effect that has been completed in the past. And what was the rest that you said?
It's still affecting them today.
And still affecting them. Okay.
Yeah, so their disbelief was basically how they came into the world in John's mind. They started out as unbelievers. And so that's in the past. This is how they are default. But the effect of that unbelief is ongoing. When I teach this class again, I'm going to have to remember 2-inch margins.
Okay, starting as a non-believer, in the past, and continues, right?
And the effect continues. The fact that they are unbelievers is something that happens in the beginning, and that state maintains, but there's no necessarily conscious effort on that one. They started out that way, but the effects linger. Yeah, they're not ongoing making the decisions. They were in that state, and that's already been completed.
I think I got it.
That one is a little bit tougher.
We'll find out.
All right, so just as a general question then here, between these two passages that we have in the Gospel of John, what are some things that we draw from this?
Well, we have basically a temporary belief that really wasn't internal, if you will. That would be the first one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John talks about a belief that has no substance to it, basically.
Yes.
And that there are people who are going to have a belief that has no substance to it, which is sad.
It's just this surface, like you said, external, outward. I'm almost saying for the time type of belief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've probably even known people in our daily lives who've had that belief for a time.
Yeah.
And even looks pretty good for a time.
Yes.
But then something comes up and it goes bye-bye. It doesn't linger. It doesn't persevere.
Their depth or lack of.
There, yes. There you go.
Yeah.
Bump in the road, jump out.
And yes, you can tell that it was not internal.
And then going on from there.
Okay.
So that's the first kind of belief that John talks about.
This is ongoing action. The one who believes in him. This is an ongoing
It's an internal.
and internal. Yeah, it's the opposite of what we just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the people who
Yes.
believe in the miraculous signs of Jesus, it's great, fine, and wonderful, but they are, in a lot of senses, focused on the external. And there isn't an internal aspect to it. In the case of John 3:18, though, the emphasis now is instead very much internal and very much ongoing, yeah. Okay. And then the third kind of belief that John talks about.
That is a non-belief that has has been completed in the past. I hope I don't say this wrong.
The
but-
non-belief was completed in the past,
Yes.
Mhm.
but they're still suffering the consequences.
Yes.
Yeah, so you have the basically the natural state of man, which is the has not believed.
Yes.
They start out as unbelievers, and frankly, that's the truth. We all start out selfish, and the world revolves around us. So we all start out as unbelievers. And it's not so much a conscious choice as it is the fact of our existence. We
It is what it is.
we're we're very, 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 very egocentric, very self-centered. And then we encounter Christ. And there's two ways that we can encounter Christ. Either as something that we participate in as religious activity, in a very worldly sense. You know, you came to this thing, whatever religion it happens to be, almost all religions are the same ways. You have some kind of a religious experience, and then you try to live a good life afterwards. Pretty much every religion teaches that. So it's this emphasis of external things. You do this external rite where you become whatever this is, whether it be a Buddhist or Catholic or whatever it is. And then you go and you try to lead a good life, and it's all stuff that you're forcing onto your natural self. Or you can have the kind of belief that isn't forced onto your natural self, but instead it is something that is done internally. Something that actually produces real lasting change. Yeah, I like using John as an example for this one because he uses the grammar to great extent on that one. He's very precise about which tenses he uses in each case. And he will, when he's talking about people who do not wind up actually having a persevering faith, he never, ever describes them in the progressive internal category. It's almost always in the aorist. I think there might be a time or two it's in the future, but almost always in the aorist. And then when he's talking about the state of man, yeah, it turns out it's something that's completed. This is mankind's natural state, just how he is. That's how he was from the beginning, and the effects linger. John is very precise about that. Interesting side notes. All right, so any questions about those?
I don't think so, not yet.
Not at the moment.
Yes.
All right. And then our last section, it's hard to believe, but we're actually already there. We can actually finish on time. What a great thought. This is the voice mood section, and this I really didn't get a whole lot from Mounts' stuff, because like I said, Mounts' stuff that he has is developed for people who've already had a little bit of Greek. So most of this I pulled out of Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. So if you're wondering why it doesn't quite match up with Mounts, it's because it wasn't from Mounts. Yeah.
Do we have this resource?
Well, I have this resource.
You have the resource. I don't have the resource.
It's this one, yeah.
If we need it, we can.
Yeah. If you need it, it is available.
Okay.
But yeah, that's where it comes from. It's kind of long. It's like 800 pages, so most people don't like to read
Oh,
it.
is that
Get
that
started.
is that the one that you referred to back in the previous lesson, that 85 pages were
Just on the article. Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's that one.
Oh,
Yeah, if you wonder about the details, Mounts will give you, not Mounts, but Wallace will give you the details. Lots of details. But yeah, so I condensed that down, and this is what I came up with. All right, so A, we discussed voice when we discussed case. And we found that voice determines whether the nominative, which we said before was the subject of the sentence, is the actor or is being acted upon. If it's the actor, it is the active voice. If it is being acted upon, it's not the actor anymore, it's passive. So that is what the voice of the verb tells us. Is the subject the actor, or is it being acted upon? All right, so let's do an example of active. We can say, I washed the car. The I is the subject of the sentence. It's the nominative. Is the I the one who is doing the action, or is the I the one that is receiving the action?
I is doing the action.
It is doing the action, so this is an active verb. Washed is active. Now, if I say the car was washed, well, the subject of the sentence is now the car. Is it the one that is doing the action, or is it the thing that is being acted upon?
Being acted upon.
It's being acted upon, so that's a passive example. Fairly straightforward, especially on this side. Now that we've already played with it, we've already played with it when we saw cases, so it's not so bad now. Now, one thing that we didn't discuss really when we discussed cases, I think we covered it just a little bit, but we didn't really get into any great detail, and there's not a whole lot of detail there, is the middle voice. And the middle voice occurs when the action of the nominative, the subject of the sentence, reflects back on itself some way. And the example there would be something like, I washed myself. I am the one who's doing the washing, and I am the thing that is being washed. So that would be a middle use. Now that one's actually kind of interesting because in English we actually wind up with the same form for both the active and the middle. And when you guys translate Greek, you will find that where you have a middle verb, you'll usually translate it as if it was an active verb, and then just put something in the context to make sure that your audience knows it reflects back on itself. Like here I've put myself in parentheses just to make it more clear. In English, active and middle are usually very similar, if not identical. And you can usually translate them pretty much identically. Which is why we didn't really worry about it last time.
Active is what?
So the active and the middle will usually have the same form in English.
Oh.
The only difference is what is actually happening, but we use the same form for it in English.
I see. Okay.
So in Greek, when you see a middle verb, you don't have to think of, well, what's special, what weird thing do I have to do here? You can usually just use an active form, and you'll be just fine. Yeah, and you might have to put something more into the context to let you know it reflects back on itself, like putting in myself to say that it's reflecting back on the original person or the original doer. But usually it's an active verb, but you put something else in there to make it reflect back. And that's all there is to it. All right, so questions about voice, active, passive, and middle. Okay. Like I said, we did cover that one before, so not as big of a deal. Yeah. So we're done with voice. It means we get to move to mood. Besides tense and voice, Koine verbs also have mood. Yay! Mood is used to express whether the action or state that the verb denotes is conceived of as a fact or in some other manner, such as a command, possibility, or wish. So basically, what is the speaker's attitude towards the thing that they're trying to relate? Are they trying to say that this is something that they're certain of, that it's a fact? Or are they saying that trying to relate this thing as a command that you're supposed to obey? Are they merely relating that it's a possibility, which we often do with tone in English? Yeah. Or is it a wish? That's what mood is. And most verbs in Greek are moody. I couldn't resist. But Participles do not, and I can't remember if infinitives do or not. No, they don't. Infinitives do not have mood either, which is why they get their own kind of separate category.
Okay, so you said, what was moody?
Most verbs in Greek are moody.
Verbs are moody.
Okay.
Are you in commanding mood?
Pretty much.
Are you in a wishing mood? Or are you a possibility?
Yeah, the possibility mood is usually fairly annoying. Stupid optimists. All right, the first mood that we're going to talk about, actually, give me a second. Are you guys done with C and D? That's what I should have asked first. Sorry.
Okay, let me read this one more time.
Basically the person's attitude towards what they're saying.
Person's attitude.
Mm-hmm. Are they trying to convey that this is a fact? Are they trying to command something? Are they saying it's a possibility? How do they feel about what they're saying?
Okay.
Right, so the first mood or attitude that we're going to talk about is the indicative. And it is the mood of assertion, which is a presentation with certainty. I'm certain about this thing. I'm presenting this as if it were a fact. This is the mood that you usually see associated with historical texts, for example. When they record that this happened, this person did such a thing at such and such a time, they are presenting this history as fact. They're presenting it with certainty. The indicative is the mood of history. It is the mood of assertion. It is the mood of certainty. And it also turns out to be the only mood, which is unfortunate, but it is the only mood that interacts with tense to make the time component of tense behave as an absolute temporal marker. So that chart that I gave you that has the past, present, and future on it, most of the time the past, present, future they're kind of like guidelines. But in the indicative, they're pretty much definite. If it says aorist and the past goes with the aorist and it's in the indicative, it actually did happen in the past. If it says future and it's in the indicative, it really does take place in the future. The other moods, not so much. But with the indicative, it's pretty much an absolute. That being said, it can be affected by genre, subject matter, and things like that. What do I mean? Take parables, for example. Parables will often present something as fact. They will use the indicative, but it's a parable. We know it's an allegory. We know it's not really a fact. So that's the case where you have it being presented as something that happens in a particular time. Well, a farmer went out to sow his field. Well, it's presented as fact in the past, but does that mean that there was actually a farmer who went out in the past and did this? No, it's a story that illustrates a lesson. So for the purposes of the story, it's considered to be true. But we know because of the genre that it's a story. It's a parable. But the main point on that one is you would still translate it as if it was an absolute temporal marker. You're still going to translate the story with the time markers that the story uses. So if you're translating through the New Testament, the books that you're going to have the most amount of indicative in them, what would be your guess? Well, it would include parables. Yeah, the Gospels. Gospels, Acts, anything that has history that's being presented as fact, most of it's going to be in the indicative. Now, when you get to the specific conversations that they have, that might be a little bit different, but the basic material of what happens, that's going to be indicative. So yeah, the Gospels, Acts, going to have lots of indicative in there.
So basically the indicative is what happens.
What the speaker understands to be the truth about what happens. Now, of course, if the person that is speaking isn't all that reliable, it might not actually happen. But the idea is that the speaker considers it to be true. The speaker is presenting this as a fact. They want you to accept that it is a fact.
Okay, so you said what the speaker considers is true, and then you said something else after that.
Or what the speaker wants you to think of as a fact. So a liar, for example, could use the indicative because they want you to think that what they're lying about is really a fact. Yeah, I was home yesterday with my dog. No, I was not anywhere near him to murder him. No, and my dog can testify. I got a solid alibi. That would be in the indicative because he wants you to think of it as fact. That just doesn't mean that it is. And that, again, has to do with that whole issue of genre and subject matter and things like that.
Okay, so what the speaker considers is true, or what the speaker wants you to believe is fact.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And that could go either way, right?
What do you mean?
Like what he, what he considers is true and what he wants you to believe is fact. It really could be fact, or he could be bamboozling you.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yeah, but the main thing is that he's presenting it as fact. Either way, whether he believes it to be true or he just wants you to believe that it's true, he's presenting it as fact. And that's the main emphasis. It's a presentation of fact. It doesn't mean it is, but it's presented as if it were.
Presenting it as. Okay.
All right, so that is the indicative, and like I said, in the historical sections, that's like all over the place. And it is the only one that actually fixes the tenses so that they actually behave in a somewhat normal English way. So if you want to start out translating verbs, go to the Gospels or Acts. The verbs there will be much nicer and better behaved because most of them will be indicative, and you can think of them in past, present, and future. But there are 3 other moods, and they don't behave that way at all. And the 3 other moods, it is much more so the aspect ends of tense. Yeah. And the other ones, you're going to look much more at aspect than you are at time. So the next one is the subjunctive. And the subjunctive usually indicates that the verbal action is uncertain but probable.
Uncertain.
But probable. Yeah. I will probably go to the store. I would like to have a pizza. I don't know how probable that is right now. I wonder if Pizza Cash is still open.
It's not on a Sunday.
Well, then the subjunctive would not be a good one for that one.
Are down there at the store.
Yeah, there's some frozen friends.
Yeah, the subjunctive is looking less and less likely for this one here. Or might have to go into the next one. But yeah, uncertain but probable is the basic idea with the subjunctive. But the subjunctive always winds up messing people up, so be very, very careful about it. When I say it's uncertain but probable, it's in the majority of cases, but it's not an overwhelming majority of cases. It's like
Not overwhelming majority.
It's not an overwhelming majority at all. Because there's the cases where the optative is used, and then there's all the hina clauses. And so I think it's only about 2/3 of the time that it's actually the uncertain but probable, which is still fairly often, but it's not like nearly every time. About 1/3 of the time it's going to fall into another category, and that's what the rest of the statement is about.
Okay.
So the rest of it says, yet it may take on the attributes of the optative mood, which we'll discuss here in a second. So it could be like that. And the reason for that is that the optative was actually dropping out in Koine Greek, and they used the subjunctive in its place. They were simplifying the language. We don't need as many moods. So sometimes it'll take up over the optatives, or be preceded by hina, or hapos, or any word like that could be translated as that or so that, something that's causative, to form a statement of purpose. So if you have the subjunctive and it has something that's causative in front of it, it's not uncertain but probable anymore. Instead, it's a statement of purpose. And in fact, That is almost, yeah, that's about 1/3 of the time is it's going to be a statement of purpose. So yeah, uncertain but probable does occur pretty often, but a very, very, very close second is the purpose statement. And it'll be hina or hapos or something like that that will indicate purpose, that, so that, because. Those will be the ways that those words get translated. And I actually had to go hunting for hapos, because I don't think Wallace actually talked about that one. He talks about hina a lot. Hapos is something that doesn't show up as often. So I did extra research for you guys.
Ooh.
It was mostly because it came up in later stuff, so I kind of had to.
So what kind of words are close to you?
Hina and hapos are basically statements of purpose. When you look at the available ways to translate them, they'll say that, or in order that, or so that, or because. They indicate that a purpose follows. And then you'll usually have the subjunctive in there, but the fact that you have these words that indicate purpose tells you that this indicates purpose, which you would think is fairly straightforward, but lots of translators mess that up. Sometimes it's out of ignorance, but a lot of times it's actually just out of tradition. This is the way we've always translated it, so we're just going to keep translating it that way, even if it is slightly confusing. Most of the time in your English translations where it uses the word may or might, it's an indication that there's a subjunctive being used somewhere. But about 1/3 of the time, that may or might is actually going to be a will or would or some other definite statement of purpose.
May or might is indicative of the subjunctive.
In English translation, that's almost always how the subjunctive gets translated. Whether or not it's a purpose statement. They translate them all the same. Right, and then the optative is the second mood, and it generally portrays an action as possible, and that is its primary emphasis. It is the mood of possibility. It's a little bit different from the subjunctive. The subjunctive has that it's probable, it's likely. Optative, it's not talking about likelihood or probability. Instead, it's just, is it possible or not? We're not worried about how likely it is it possible or not?
Okay. Just in the general.
Yeah.
If it's possible. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. There's no way that it leans. Can it be or can't it?
Okay.
That's all that's really in view there. And as to use, it can be used for wishes and conditionals. When you express a wish to someone, when you request something of them, there's always an implied possibility there. Can you get the chair for me? Is it possible or not? Of course, you're really wanting them to do it, but it's stated as a possibility, which creates all kinds of problems in English because we hear that and we say that's not really a proper question. Because we do the may you please get the chair for me, or may I go to the bathroom, or whatever. But in Greek, it would actually be more of a can. Is this possible? And in most languages, it's a possible emphasis. So if you have someone from another language speaking in English, they're going to mess that up like every single time. They're almost always going to say, can I do this? Or
because that's how we understand it.
Yeah, we have formal words for wishes, but in most other languages, the wishes are subsumed under possibles. They're subsumed under the optatives, which is why they always mess up on it. And then you get picky with them, and they're just sitting there going, what on earth are you talking about? I asked you a legitimate question. What are you doing? Yeah. And then it's also used for conditionals. If this happens, then I will do this. It's possible, but under these conditions.
Okay.
Yeah, but it all relates back to possibility. Yeah, questions and wishes are usually expressed in terms of possibility, and conditionals are usually expressed in possibility. It's possible if this happens.
Okay, it says it was fading in Koine Greek. What does that mean?
Okay, in Koine Greek, like a lot of languages, Koine Greek, of course, and we've discussed this before, it was kind of a Pidgin or Creole form. There was a lot of influence from the languages that were originally in the area before Koine Greek came in.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens in those kinds of scenarios is there's always going to be an emphasis on simplifying things.
Okay.
What always happens when you have another language being used by another language group. You know, like take people who come into the United States learning English.
Mm-hmm.
When they first learn English, they're going to simplify it down.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the fine distinctions they're not going to get. The optative was like that in Koine Greek. Not everyone understood the subtlety that had to do with the optative. And a lot of people just simply didn't use it because it was a weird subtlety. For most people who were using it in that region, the subjunctive made more sense to them.
Okay.
So they would usually express it as something that's possible with the probability on top of it. So most people prefer to use the subjunctive. The optative was used a little bit, but not very much.
So not used as much.
Yeah. So the Greek overlords had already left by this time, and people were left to do with the language as they saw fit. And they said, we don't really like this category, we don't really use it.
So they started using the subjunctive more.
Yes, they started using the subjunctive to replace most of the things that would be done with the optative. And that's why the subjunctive doesn't always behave like a proper subjunctive does. Because it starts taking over another mood.
Okay.
All right. And then the last, but certainly not least mood is the imperative. One thing to watch out for on this one, in the parsing codes, it will be the M that shows up in the parsing code instead of the I. And the reason for that is that the I was already used with the indicative. So they had to go with another letter and they used the M. But most of us are already pretty familiar with imperatives. It's the mood of intention, and it is used for commands, prohibitions, and things like that. When you're telling someone to do something or that they should do this kind of thing, that's what an imperative is. But there's also another use that shows up in Greek that's really interesting, and it is requests with known affirmative answers are often done with imperatives. And it's actually one that's relatively important for what you guys are going to be doing at the end of this course, because we talked about doing the Lord's Prayer. And it turns out that this use of the imperative shows up there, where you have a request with known affirmative answers. That is, if the outcome of a request is known, it is usually put in the form of a command. It's not actually meant as a command, but it's put in the form of a command because it is certain. In that case, it's used to indicate its certainty.
Okay, used to what?
It says in the thing, it's also used for requests with known affirmative answers.
Okay, but you just made a right. You just said it's used when you know that it's certainty.
It's used to indicate certainty in that sense. You know that there's going to be an affirmative answer. You know what the outcome is going to be, and so you use an imperative. It indicates that the speaker knows what the outcome is going to be. Like I said, this does show up in the Lord's Prayer.
Rhetorical questions. Once you know the answer, but you ask them anyway.
Yep. Yeah.
It can be used when the speaker knows what the answer will be.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, when those kinds of imperatives are given, it's not an actual command. It's given to say that I know this is going to happen. which is another thing that translations don't always pick up on very well. They just see that it's imperative and they usually just translate it as some kind of an imperative. But that's not actually the emphasis.
Novetic, computer program for grammar,
Mm-hmm.
brought out another kind of imperative that is that same thing. And I wish I could remember what they called it. Confused my kids all to crap. Wasn't really asking them a question.
Mm-hmm.
It was making a statement that they knew the answer to. It was a command type statement.
Mm-hmm.
Something to do with imperatives. Wish I remembered that. Also look it up. Already. Most of the computer online is free.
There you go. Okay, so those are the 4 moods. The indicative, basically the speaker wants you to consider this to be fact. The subjunctive, it's uncertain, but it's probable, unless you have hina or hapos or something like that that actually indicates purpose, and then it becomes a purpose clause. Then there's the optative, where the emphasis is on possibility. It's not necessarily one way or the other, it's just, is it possible or not? And that one wasn't getting used as much in Koine Greek. It was fading out of existence and subjunctive was taking over for it. And then there's also the imperative, which a lot of times has to do with commands and prohibitions, but there is a special use that shows up fairly frequently, and that is a request with a known affirmative answer. So let's take a look at an example. And I love this example because it's one of those where I found everything in one verse and it's like, that's the one I'm using.
So you didn't have to use 3 verses?
Exactly, or 4 verses in this case.
Yes, that's true.
Sorry, was everyone done with that slide?
Yes.
Okay, so let's take a look at the example verse. And I love it. Example of moods. It's just everything, all there. All right, so this is Romans 3:4, and it says, and this is going out of the NASB, may it never be, rather let God be found true, though every man be found a liar, and it is written that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. Oh, sorry, as it is written, not and it, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. All right, so I found 4 verbs in there. There's actually technically more than 4, but these are the 4 we're going to focus on. They all have a different mood, and they're all normal, proper verbs. There's no participles or anything like that in this one. It's a very well-behaved example. I love this one. So the first one, the may it be verb, is of course a verb. And then the first A there tells us that it is an aorist. And then the M tells us that it's middle voice. But like we said, with the middle voice in Greek, you can usually translate it as an active, so you don't really have to worry about that much. And then the O, which is what we're going to focus on, is what mood? Optative. And then we have the 3S on there for third person singular, but we're not going to focus on that. The main thing is that it's optative. So this is Paul writing to the Romans. He says, may it never be, and the actual verbal part of that is the may it be part. And he puts it in the optative mood, and the question is why? Why does he use that mood over another mood? What is he communicating with that?
It's not possible.
Yeah, the optative emphasizes possibility, and he's negating it. He's putting in the never there. So what he's saying is this isn't even possible, guys. And I don't really like this translation because it actually doesn't quite communicate that. A better translation would probably be something along the lines of absolutely not, or something like that. Because it's not really a request, and the may in there makes it kind of sound like a request. That's not what he's getting at. Instead, he's saying, this isn't possible, guys. This is never going to happen. Yeah, this is not possible. Yeah. And of course, if you guys know the context there, it's, well, actually, let's go ahead and look that up. We have our interlinears here. We might just have a little bit of fun with them. Woohoo! We look up words.
We're using the big guy.
Yep.
Okay, that's a big one.
Romans 3:4.
Yeah. So when he's saying, may it never be, what is he saying will never be? This isn't even possible. This isn't going to happen.
Let me
You'll probably want to read in one of the side texts.
Okay, it says, may it never be, rather let God be found true.
We already have that in the verse.
Okay.
So before that, in verse 3, what is it talking about that
Okay,
that it may never be? What is he saying is not possible?
Some were unfaithful. Oh, no, will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness?
Yeah. And Paul's response is, it's not even possible.
Right.
Yeah. He's not hoping. He's not saying, well, I really hope that doesn't happen. That's not what he's saying.
Yeah.
He's saying this isn't even possible. That's why he uses the optative. And like I said, I don't really like this particular translation because it has the may in there, which makes it sound like a request, and it's not.
Okay, and so that was a translator. Liberty, if you will.
It's tradition is more so what it is.
Okay.
A lot of times when the optative shows up, and also when the subjunctive shows up, they will translate both of them with may and might. That's traditional translation, is optative and subjunctive get may and might.
Okay.
I don't follow that rule because that doesn't actually necessarily follow what the actual meaning was.
Okay.
But word-for-word translations will usually do it so that the person reading it knows that there's either a subjunctive or an optative there.
Okay, may or might.
In a formal translation, in a traditional formal translation, indicates that a subjunctive is being used or an optative is being used. Of course, that doesn't actually tell you what the subjunctive is doing or what the optative is doing, but it's kind of a nice marker to know that it's there. But yeah, this is not a request. Paul is not hoping that this is not going to happen. He's saying this isn't going to happen. It's not possible, guys.
Okay, so the formal translation of may or might indicate a subjunctive or what?
Or an optative. In this case, it's an optative.
There's that word. So that.
Yep. Yeah, this was the example that forced me to look it up. It was like, oh, that's a little different.
Okay.
All right, then for the next verb, let be found. Technically found actually isn't part of that, but it is a verb. And the P right after the verb stands for what? Not passive.
Present.
It is present, right? And then the M is middle. And like we said, with middle, we don't really worry about it in translation that much. We translate it just as if it was active. It's usually not going to mess anything up.
Okay.
And then the second M, which is what we are interested in, that's the mood. And what mood is this? It's imperative. And then the 3S on it is third person singular. We already know about that, but we're going to focus on the imperative. Let God be found true. And Paul is actually using an imperative here. We usually translate it as a request, let God be found, but it's actually an imperative. And why is this an imperative?
He knows the answer is going to be no.
He knows what the answer is going to be found. Yes, he knows the answer. Let God be found true. Yes, God is going to be found true. So it is a request, but it's a request with a known affirmative answer. He knows it's going to come out yes. And so the translation on this one actually isn't all that bad. Let God be found. It is a request, but the answer on this one, because it's imperative, is absolutely certain. And that one's actually really hard to translate into English well. Because every time you say let in English, let God be found true, it sounds like you're hoping. But in the Greek, that's not the case. It's still a request in Greek, but you're saying the outcome is definite. The outcome is fixed and sure. And that's really hard to communicate in a translation. That's one of those things you almost have to put a footnote on. When he says this, what he means is da-da-da-da-da-da. Of course, if you did that with every verse in the New Testament, you'd have more translators' notes than would text.
You'd go crazy.
It would be a very long translation. That's basically what the Net Bible is. It's the main translation, and then they have translator's notes the whole way through, and there's like, what is it? The new edition has like 58,000 translator's notes in it. It's a useful tool, but it is a lot of material to go through.
The net, you said.
Yeah.
That's
Many, 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 many notes. All right, and then the next verb in there, it is written, and the it actually comes from the third person singular. But that's not the main emphasis. Going through the parsing code, we have V for verb, and then what does the R stand in for? Perfect, correct. And then the P? Passive. Yeah. We don't have who is doing the writing here, so we don't have the actor, we just have that it's written, so it's passive. And then the one that we're going to focus on is the I, and what is I? Not imperative.
Oh, indicative. Sorry.
Indicative. Yeah, that one always messes people up because they both start with the same letter, but
Yes.
they don't have the same parsing code. Yeah, and it's third person singular, we won't worry about that too much. But the I, indicative, what is that telling us? Why is the indicative used here when it talks about what it was written?
It's presented with a certainty. It is written.
Really, really, really close.
It's in history. Oh, no.
You know, you're right. It is history.
Historical.
Yeah, it's a historical fact. This is what was written down.
It is written. It means
It's historical
Yeah.
fact.
it's happened in history.
Yeah.
It's written in history. Okay.
Historical.
Historical fact. Yep. So that one's pretty basic when you want to relate something generally to a reader or listener, as the case may be, and you want them to understand it as a basic fact. It's the indicative. So it's not necessarily forceful, it's just this is how it is. All right, and then we have the that, and that is translating hapos. And then we have the next verb, you may be justified. And it has V for verb. And that first A there, what does that first A stand for?
Aorist.
Aorist, yep. And then the P is
Passive.
passive. We don't know who's doing the justifying. We just know that he's being justified, but we don't know who's doing the justifying. And then the S, which is where we're going to focus, what is that? Subjunctive, right. The subjunctive kind of became the catch-all mood. And it is second person singular. So you may be justified in your words. What is the subjunctive doing here?
It's
Saying it's possible that you will be.
it's uncertain, but it is a possibility.
No.
No, it's not.
This is one of the exceptions.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's got that verb. It's got that henna. So it tells us this is a statement of this.
Mm-hmm.
You may be justified. The purpose will be that you will be justified.
That you will be justified is how we would actually translate it in English normally if we wanted to communicate that meaning. But they don't do it in formal translations of the Bible because formal translations of the Bible always use may and might for optative and subjunctive. So yeah, may is not actually a very useful translation there.
Okay.
Will is more accurate.
There's an if then. If you do this, then you will be justified.
No, that would be optative. No, it's just saying so that you will be justified.
Okay.
You're fine.
Okay, so it's subjunctive,
Mm-hmm.
and it's subjunctive because
Well, it tells us that it's a subjunctive.
yes, and
But the reason why it isn't a normal subjunctive, which is usually uncertain but probable, is because we have that word hapos in there, which is the one I put in red.
hapos is that exception to
It's
that.
one of the exceptions. The other exception is when it's functioning as the optative, but you're not going to see that very often. The main one that you need to worry about is hennas and haposes and statements of purpose. That, so that, this will happen, so that you will be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. Mm-hmm.
Okay, the adding what makes it
Adding this.
The hopos in there.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you have a word that indicates purpose with the subjunctive will follow suit. But yes, normally it would be uncertain but probable, but if you have a purpose word in there, no, it's going to be purpose. Yeah. So what we found here is that the may and might thing that a lot of formal translations do is really confusing, and I hate it.
So this, because it has the hopos, it makes it a statement of purpose.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Hopos is a purpose word. And so the subjunctive will just follow along with that. And a lot of people wonder, well, why, if you're stating that this is a purpose, that it's something that's fairly definite, why don't you use the indicative? And the basic reason for that is that the indicative is usually something that is an existent fact right now. It's not usually in the realm of ideas, which is what this is. It would be more of a conceptual thing, and it's usually doesn't relate as much to the future, and so that's why the subjunctive wind up filling in that role.
So, so that's what we're saying. You may be justified, and you will be justified.
Yes.
The may becomes will.
Exactly. Now, may and might are used in formal translations to indicate that there's a subjunctive there or that there's an optative there. But when it's being used as a part of a purpose clause where it has that or so that or in order that, because something like that, some kind of a purpose statement in there, it will follow along with purpose.
Okay, state that again.
All right, so if you have a purpose word in there, like that, or so that, in order that, because, something that indicates purpose, the subjunctive will follow along with that. It will also indicate purpose.
How do I write that down?
I don't know.
Okay, well, I just won't write that. How about that? And if I get it wrong, we'll worry about that later.
Well, the basic idea that the only real question that you have to ask yourselves on this one is this part right here being affected by something that indicates purpose. If it does, then it's a purpose clause.
Does it indicate purpose?
Is there a word in there that indicates purpose? Okay. Yes, it's a purpose clause. If no, then you try a normal subjunctive. Yeah, so hina, hopos, those kinds of words indicate purpose. They control the subjunctive. All right, and that is the end. That is everything, amazingly. So what that means is that you guys have the entire homework
I
assignment.
can do all of it.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, that's the bad news, but the good news is we got through all of verbs. Well, the first section on verbs, I should say. So congratulations on that one. Online people, catch you later. Good luck on the homework, and yeah, see you.